Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is John Holden, and I'm a junior forestry student in WVU's Division of Forestry and Natural Resources. And I'm going to present a study titled Preliminary Assessment of Climatic Sensitivity of Riparian Old Growth Hemlock that was completed by myself, Dr. Steve Chin, Andrew Hirsch, and Eric Yetter. Okay, so I'm going to begin by introducing everyone to our tree species that we are studying in this project, which is eastern hemlock. It is a coniferous tree species that is found within our region, or really from the Great Lakes region down to the southern states. It is a long-lived, slow-growing climax tree species. So what that means is that, long-lived, pretty self-explanatory. It is one of the oldest living tree species in the United States. It can often live to be hundreds of years old, I think up to 500 or even older than that. It's very slow growing, especially in its early stages. So it utilizes its shade-tolerant ability to subsist in the understory and kind of just barely compete with the faster-growing trees. And then eventually, since it's so long-lived and resilient, it will eventually surpass the faster growing trees and become the dominant tree species within the canopy. This is very actually pertinent to our study site, hence the old growth term, because you can see what this looks like really when hemlock have had enough time to grow within a stand and become the dominant tree species. So they're currently undergoing a major decline in population, which is at the hand of this nasty picture here on the bottom left, which are the ovisacs of Hemlock woolly adelgid, which that's kind of like the main way that you can identify an infected tree is by these ovisacs, which are sort of just where they reside, I guess. And it could also be their decline could also be at least partially attributed to changing climate patterns. So that's partly what we're studying is to see how hemlock is responding to changes in monthly temperature. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about our study objectives. So our objectives are to kind of just see how monthly climate variables affect radial growth of hemlock located within our region, old growth hemlock to be specific. So to do this, we use tree cores, which are just cylindrical pieces of xylem tissue taken from the tree using an increment borer. So we use this so that we don't have to cut down the tree to examine its rings. So by taking a core, we can extract the growth rings, hopefully from the bark to the center of the tree. That's what we're aiming for. That gives you the most rings. So then you can analyze them, which kind of leads to my next point here, which is the study of dendroclimatology. So I think that's probably the best term to describe this project. So when analyzing a tree core, you can tell how trees are growing at certain intervals in time based on the width of their rings. So narrow rings indicate that the tree is struggling, could be suppressed, could be having a hard time gaining light resources, nutrients, or it could be something more environmental or climatic. So it could be there could be too much precipitation, or there could be too hot, or it could be too cold. So there are a lot of different ways that you can analyze the ring widths. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about our study site. I think it's important to introduce it as a little bit of a part of the background. So it is the Old Growth Hemlock Trail in the University Forest, which is pretty much just out off the same exit as the Cooper's Rock State Forest. It has been found to have populations of Hemlock woolly adelgid. As of now, the infestation is relatively low, but this could possibly be due to the site being a kind of a rather like healthier site for the tree, as it's kind of bisected by little laurel run, as I said. yeah, so the stand is comprised of 54% eastern hemlock, 12% black birch, 11% red maple, and the rest of that is mixed oaks with some black gum. And I think the most important piece of information from this slide is that less than 1% of old growth hemlock stands within the region still exist. I think that is really interesting, and I think that with more concern over the ability for hemlock to survive into the future because of the hemlock woolly adelgid, I think that studying these sites is very important to see how they respond to different climatic effects. So now I'm going to talk a little bit more about increment borers and collecting tree cores and what we do with them, I guess, and other things that we did in the field. So in this top picture here, that is an increment borer. And so essentially you just kind of drill it into the tree, and in the center here of the bore, at the center of the handle, you can extract the core. And once you do that, you mount the core. You let it dry first, obviously, and then you mount the core onto like a piece of wood like this, like a piece of molding, and then you sand it down progressively. So you start with rougher grits, and then you start to smooth it out up to 400 grit, so that you can really see the annual rings. It's so polished. For our inventory data, we used 5 1/10 acre sample plots. So that's essentially a circular plot in the woods, and it has a 37.2 foot radius. So what we did was we measured all of the trees within that area, greater than 4 inches in diameter at breast height, so that's 4.5 feet. And yeah, so then we cored the largest hemlock, and then the four succeeding it, and twice. We did that twice to each of them. And then on top of that, we also collected diameter measurements on each of the trees that we can use for further analysis, which I'll get to later in the report. So in total, we actually had 50 hemlock cores. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about our statistical analysis. So we visually cross-dated the cores. So that's how you manually attribute different rings to the correct year. So you can actually discern a pattern of narrow rings within your core set, and those become marker rings. So they have to appear on, I think, 70% of all of your rings. So my marker rings were like 2001, 1999. Those were definitely the most prominent. So I could tell that spots of the tree that did not, or spots of the core that did not align with others were not cross-dated correctly, which you kind of do this by marking down the positions of the narrow rings of the core and then comparing them to the other trees. And then once you do that, you can measure the widths of the rings using a computer. It would be quite a pain to have to do that manually, but luckily we have software, which is the coup recorder program, which you kind of just find, you connect the rings so that they're parallel, and you measure them using the software. And then once you do that, you can check your work on CoFetcha, which is sort of a statistical program that determines the series intercorrelation and will flag areas, of course, that it does not think are dated properly. And then once you do that, you can use RSTAN, which is sort of a standardizing program that will remove canopy or age-related growth factors. So more on the statistical analysis. I felt that this program deserved its own slide. So dendroclimb is sort of like the culmination of the analysis. Once you develop your standardized chronology from RSTAN, you can then run it through dendroclimb with different monthly climate variables. So we chose to use mean temperature, precipitation, and climate moisture index, which is just a function of evapotranspiration, precipitation, and elevation, which is really just a measure of net water availability. So now I will get into our results. Okay, so my first figure here is trees per acre plotted by 2-inch diameter classes by species. So you can see that eastern hemlock is the main component of the forest here, and that the distribution of this graph is reverse J. So that shows us that it's characteristic of other old growth stands, other uneven aged stands. So we measured all trees 4 inches and above, 4 inches in diameter above, and so this is within a whole acre. This is what the composition should look like. And then here are our basal area per acre. So basal area is cross-sectional area. So the way I like to think about it is if you put quarters on a table and look down at them from like a bird's eye view, that would be like looking down at the cross-sectional area of trees. So this is a kind of a measure of what trees are taking up a lot of space in the forest, at least in basal area. Again, eastern hemlock is clearly the largest component of basal area within the stand. Okay, so now we're really getting into the real meat and potatoes of what our project was really trying to ascertain. So this graph shows the correlation coefficients between radial growth and mean monthly temperature T and precipitation P. So the reason that the months run from April of the previous year to October of the current year is so that we can view how the previous year and the current year different monthly climate variables are affecting the radial growth of hemlock. So your y-axis is the correlation coefficient, and then the x-axis is our different climate variables by month. So as you can see, September of the previous year, when mean monthly temperature increases, the radial growth of hemlock will decrease. This is the opposite effect is noticed with March of the current year, where it has a positive correlation of 0.28. So that shows that when temperatures are higher in March of the current year, growth should be expected to increase. And then May of the current year also has a negative intercorrelation of 0.26, and January precipitation of the current year is negative 0.22. So that's showing that when it rains in January a lot, it will result in less overall hemlock radial growth. Okay, so our next correlation slide is using radial growth in CMI, which is climate moisture index again, instead of temperature and precipitation. So this also looks at April of the previous year and October of the current year. So June CMI of the previous year is shown to be a negative relationship at negative 0.34, and same with January of the current year at negative 0.25, and May shows that increased climate moisture index is actually a positive relationship at 0.24. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about what all of that means. Our chronology dates back to 1959, so that's as far back as we were able to look at our monthly climate variables and how they related to radial growth. We were able to find significant positive radial growth relationships with mean March temperatures and CMI in May of the current year. So we believe the mean March temperature is due to low evapotranspiration in the spring, and which results in an early start to the growing season. So it's able to utilize more of its water resources, since it's not being lost, which is essentially what evapotranspiration is, to evaporation or transpiration by plants. And yeah, so it's kind of also just CMI in May indicates that high water availability in the summer is obviously a good thing. That's kind of a time when hemlock are struggling to have enough water. And again, cool, humid sites, that's really what hemlock are suited for. Okay, so on this slide, we are going to continue with our significant negative relationships this time instead of positive. So we determined that there are a couple of relationships associated with elevated mean temperatures in September of the prior year, as well as May of the current year. And we attribute that to moisture stress. So trees that are struggling for water resources will have a harder time respirating and will not be able to allocate photosynthate to carbon, so it won't be able to grow essentially. And then June CMI, which is again a measure of water availability. So you would expect more water availability in the summer to be a good thing, but this actually was not what we found. We found that it was actually a bad thing. So we believe that this result could have actually been because of storm damage enacted by wind on the leaves of the hemlock. So losing photosynthetic tissue is always a bad thing for trees. And then January of the current year, precipitation shows a negative relationship. So that kind of makes sense. So increased precipitation during the winter could result in frost damage to the leaves, which would also remove photosynthetic tissue. And that was another thing that was odd. We found that sites in other studies in the southern parts of the United States had the opposite effect, but we believe this could be due to different types of precipitation within our region. So down south, they'd be getting rain during the winter, and here we'd be getting snow. So that wraps up my presentation. If there are any questions, I will be happy to answer them. So thank you all very much, and I will show you all my references and acknowledge our funding. So thank you all.